Less than a month ago, after I'd completely recorded this course, Dialogflow introduced something new for fulfillment. It's not really something new though. Fulfillment is still via webhook, but you can define a cloud function in line within Dialogflow to actually fulfill your intents. It's kind of cool and it really solidifies Dialogflow's integration with the Google Cloud Platform. I'm going to show you a quick demo of how this is done. I'm not doing a complete integration with the third party Open Weather Map API. That's something you can try out on your own, but I'll show you how you can get Dialogflow to call your cloud function for fulfillment of an intent. So click on fulfillment on the left navigation pane, and the new Dialogflow UI should look somewhat like this. So you have the webhook option and you have the inline editor where you can write in some code which will be automatically deployed to Google Cloud Functions. Google Cloud Functions, if you're not familiar with it already, are the equivalent of AWS Lambdas. These are basically bits of code that are executed on the cloud. They receive notifications, execute the code in response to the notification, and send back a response to the client which hit that URL, which hit that cloud function or Lambda. The cool thing about cloud functions is that you just go ahead and write your code. The programming language that's available now, which is directly integrated with Dialogflow, is JavaScript, but I'm sure they'll add more programming languages later. We use the Node.js framework here. Cloud functions don't require you to instantiate a VM on the Google Cloud Platform and then host a server there, which is kind of what we were doing on Heroku. You just write your code and deploy it. That's it. When you use cloud functions, the webhook URL is automatically configured to point to the URL of your cloud function. So this fulfillment is still via webhook, except that your code is hosted on a cloud function. So let's write some JavaScript code. I'll run through this rather quickly. We say use strict because we want to use the strict syntax for JavaScript. We are going to use Firebase functions and actions on Google. These are two libraries that Cloud Functions on Firebase provides us. Firebase is just a suite of tools that the Google Cloud Platform offers. Firebase was a company that Google bought, and it has many cool things to set up and host your mobile backends, your web backends, and so on. All your code needs to be written within this method exports.dialogflow firebase fulfillment. You cannot change the name of this method and expect your cloud functions with Firebase to work with Dialogflow. This is kind of important. Now, this method handles the functions.https.on request, and the arguments that are passed in are the request and the response. You can put in a bunch of log statements, if you want to see what's going on. I'm simply going to log the request headers and the request body as a string. I use json.stringify for this. The JSON data that's sent via a post request to our cloud function is available in request.body. Within it, I'm interested in the result parameter. The result parameter is present. I want to process it further. Otherwise, I'm simply going to return an error with status 400. By the way, I totally understand that sometimes it's hard for you to follow along with code that's seen on screen. The zip file, which contains all of the resources for this class, contains this cloud function code as well. Now, if you have the JSON data, I want to process the request further. That is, I want to extract the parameters of city and date from the JSON data. And then, if I were to actually be building an end to end application, I'll use that to query the Open Weather Map API. Now, in the real world, if you're building a real chatbot, you'll have multiple intents which are configured to use webhook fulfillment. In such a situation, once you get the request on the server side within this cloud function, you need to determine which intent you need to fulfill. This you determine by parsing and looking at the action parameter. Action is a string that will tell you what intent you have to fulfill, and parameters is basically the parameter values that are sent along in the JSON request. We've already worked with them before, you don't need much of an explanation there. You can also use the JSON data that has been sent along with the post to determine the source of the original request. This you can do by accessing request.body.original request. dot source. There is a standard JavaScript form which people typically use when they're handling different functions based on a particular string. You simply set up a JavaScript object where the keys are the action strings and the values are basically functions that you need to execute if you match a particular action string. That's what we'll be doing here in action handlers. So if the action that you encounter from the JSON data sent in the request is input.unknown, you'll simply send a response which says, I'm having trouble, can you try that again? You didn't understand what the user wanted to do. In this JSON object, the key is a string, the value is a function. Find.weather is the action that's associated with our check weather intent. We haven't configured it, but we'll do so shortly. The function that this code should execute when it sees that the input action is find weather is to basically extract the parameter values from the JSON data, query the Open Weather Map API, and construct the appropriate response. Like I said, we're not going to show you how to query the Open Weather Map API. You already know how to do that, and you can do that for practice on your own. We are going to simply send back a basic text response. We can simply say, Hi, I'm sorry, I do not have the weather forecast for this city on this particular date. You can access the geocity and the date parameters from the parameters object that we'd initialized early on from the input JSON data in this manner. Construct the standard JSON response that Dialogflow expects from our server code, and that's what you'll send back to Dialogflow. Now we'll send it back using the send response helper function. We'll still need to write the code for that. You can also configure a function for the default action. You'll simply say this message is from Dialogflows, cloud functions, blah, blah, blah. So if it's an intent that you don't recognize, the default action will be hit. When you get the request from the server and it's an action that you don't recognize, that is, you don't have a specific function for it within your action handlers object, then you set the action to default. You've already extracted the action from the input JSON data. Simply call action handlers in square brackets action and call it as a function. Because remember, this will access the value that we set up in the action handlers object, and the value is a function that you're executing at this point. All of this syntax will be a little confusing to you if you don't know JavaScript, but for JavaScript developers, this is par for course. We'll define send response as an inner local function here, just for convenience. If the input argument is a string, you'll simply construct a JSON object response in the manner that Dialogflow expects. Dialogflow expects the speech parameter as well as the display text parameter that is set to the string response that we've passed into this function. If the response to user argument that's passed in is a JSON object, it's not a simple string, we simply extract the parameters from that JSON object and construct once again a JSON object with the speech parameter and the display parameter. This is what Dialogflow expects after all. The Node.js framework expects a package.json file, which is where you specify all the dependencies and other things that go along with the code that you want to deploy. You can use the package.json configuration that they have provided as is. There's no reason to change it. Now, click on deploy and wait for a few minutes. If this is the first time that you're deploying this code to a cloud function, it might take a while before it goes through completely. But once it's done, you've hosted your code on the Google Cloud platform and your webhook URL has automatically been configured to hit that code. See how easy it was as compared with setting up an external service. Now, whatever you've done so far, the code you've written is going to work. You're not going to be built for this, even though you've deployed a cloud function to the Google Cloud platform. That's because we are using the free tier for Firebase, which is called the Spark tier. Now, in the real world, any code that you write here will probably call an external API, such as the Open Weather Map API. Now, you can't do this if you're using the free tier for Firebase. You need to upgrade to a paid tier, but of course, you don't really want to pay for it when you're working on a class. So, what you should use is the pay as you go Blaze tier. This pay as you go tier allows a number of requests to be made to your cloud function absolutely free. The quota is something like 200,000 requests per month to your cloud function is free with some data limit as well. It should work perfectly fine if you're just testing things out. You might need to enable billing on your Google Cloud platform though to upgrade to the Blaze tier. There is one last step left before we can test this out. Go to the check whether intent and configure an action for that intent. We're going to check for that action in the server code. In fact, you've already seen the code for that. So go to check whether and specify the action to be the string find.weather. This is what we check for in our code. Then we do a bunch of the usual stuff. Configure fulfillment to be via webhook. This is if you haven't done so already. We've seen this in previous lectures in this section. Hit save and let's test out our cloud function. I want to find out what the weather in LA is like tomorrow, and the result you can see will be from my cloud function code. If you remember, we hadn't hit the Open Weather Map API. We had simply configured, I'm sorry, I do not have the weather forecast for the city that you'd mentioned and the date for which you're requesting this information. We've successfully deployed our code to a cloud function and integrated Dialogflow with it. Integrating with the Open Weather Map API to give meaningful responses is a simple step from here.